Good morning. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
We can hear you. We cannot see you at this point.
I'm afraid my camera is not working, and I apologize for that. But let me first thank all of the organizers for inviting me to address this very interesting Congress. In the last 2 days and this morning, there's been a strong focus on digital systems and their security. The issues that dealt with at this Congress are of increasing importance in our rapidly machine-driven and digitized world. Concern for securing these systems is not because of their inherent value. It is in recognition that more so than before, information is power and is the most valuable commodity in currency at present. Google, Facebook, I don't know whether they will eventually be called Meta because there's another company that is called Meta. But in any event, these organizations are not interested in information about you for its own sake, but because it has immense value and is the currency in which they deal. As countries increasingly rely on space systems to both gather and transmit information, their long-term sustainability and security grow in importance. One threat to sustainability and security of space systems and environment is its potential misuse by the military. Today, we're at a critical point. More and more countries are adopting the US rhetoric and speak about space as a war-fighting domain. This is in contradiction to the provisions of the Outer Space Treaty, which has been ratified by an overwhelming number of countries, including the Slovak Republic. How do we stop such obvious misuse of space by the military? I would suggest that there are 5 things we need to bear in mind. First, we must continue to vote at the UN in favor of the 2 treaties that have been around since the 1980s, but they have been continually opposed by the United States, whereas every other country has voted in its favor except for Israel, that has abstained. These are the PPWT, which is the Prevention of Placement of Weapons in Outer Space Treaty, and the other one is called PAROS, the Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space. So I would suggest that one thing that countries can do is to continue their support for those 2 fairly minor but a good step in that direction. I think we also need to press for inclusion of restrictions on the military as part of the guidelines on responsible behavior in outer space, which is being discussed and negotiated also at the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, a committee of the United Nations. Physical attacks in space, like ASAT, anti-satellite missiles, is less likely to occur because of self-interest. If there is a physical attack to destroy a satellite, it will create debris, and that will affect the attacker as well as its target. But, and this is something that you have been particularly focused on, cyber attacks are very likely in outer space, and that we must pursue pursue means of securing the cyber environment in order to reduce that risk. I think there are two other relevant factors that we should think about. One is to try and engage as much as we can with our terrestrial adversaries in cooperation and collaboration in outer space. This isn't something new. The United States and the Soviet Union, as it then was, collaborated and cooperated in a very successful project in space, the Apollo-Soyuz project, where the two were linked together in 1975. And this was a project that took about 5 years or so to complete. The other thing is to be careful in using language. We started early in this century talking about space as being congested, competitive, and contested. Nobody's contesting space. We all have a right to be there. And if you get into the frame of mind and use those kinds of words, we end up where we are today, where it is now. As I said, many countries talk about space as being a war-fighting domain, which would be a tremendous step back. The stance adopted to achieve these goals is a matter of policy, both at the national and the international level. Many countries are in the process of setting their policies governing space. This raises the question, who sets policy and who implements the policy? The first thing that must be borne in mind is that space policy, like policy in other areas, is meaningless in isolation. It must be seen in the context of other policies, industrial policy, economic and social policies. You look at, for example, and I keep talking about the United States because it spends the governmental expenditure on space by the United States is just a little bit more than spent by all other countries in the world. That is governmental spending. However, in the United States, private activities have become very prevalent, and there are lots of privately funded projects. That's not just a function of space policy. It is also a function of the concentration of wealth, which goes back to fiscal and social policies. If the people like Elon Musk could not accumulate enough money to do these things, there wouldn't be quite as much of it. Under the Outer Space Treaty, governments are required to both authorize and continuously supervise activities of their nationals, including those conducted by commercial and industrial organizations. Government is, of course, influenced by industry and will adopt policies that serve the interests of its nationals. But it is the government that sets the policy. There are two aspects of policy implementation. One is through laws and regulations that govern what is permitted to be done. For the UK, for example, has, as a part of its licensing process, requires plans for dealing with satellites at the end of their life to reduce debris creation. But this is a function of implementing a policy by government. The other element of implementation is through activities that are conducted. These are increasingly done by commercial firms, but the government still has a major role under its obligation to authorize and supervise those activities. So what I'm saying in brief is that at the end of the day, it is the government that is responsible for what is done in space and how it is done. Commerce and industry, of course, influence government, but the responsibility and the decision is ultimately those of governments. And increasingly, governments are taking these responsibilities seriously, and it is good to see that newcomers in this area continue to do that. I thank you very much for this opportunity, and that I will end with. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mosteshar.